My parents adopted me when I was 6 weeks old. From birth, I was placed into foster care with a foster family here in Louisville. My parents had been married for 12 years when they adopted me, and they adopted me through a local Christian agency that was here in town. They had been on the waiting list with their agency for 7 years at that point, so they had waited a long time to start their family. The best thing, as far as my experience in being adopted, was all in the way that my parents handled it as I was growing up. And I think that plays a huge part in how I view adoption today. My parents always made it just a normal part of who we were as a family. They always made it just as normal as the fact that I have brown eyes and brown hair. It was never a big deal, but it was just the way that God created our family. When I was almost 5 years old, we adopted my sister. We got her when she was 9 days old. And up until I was in high school, we didn't know any other kids that were adopted. So it was always just the two of us to share that experience together. Even having that limited frame of reference for adoption, it was always a positive experience in our family. We were always the only adopted kids at church or in our classes at school. But I could never say that we felt singled out by that. And that is really because of the way that our parents raised us to view adoption and what it was. And it was simply just the way that God decided to make our family. As an adult, I came to realize the value in that. After talking to other people who were adopted or talking to families who had questions about what adoption looks like, just seeing the role that my parents took in making that our family made all the difference in the world. So that's why my experience with adoption has always been one that's been very positive. So I have to give all the credit to my mom and dad for that. Growing up, you did have questions about being adopted. I have always thought about it every year on my birthday, just wondering where my birth parents are, how they're doing, what their life ended up being like. Are they thinking of me and what happened in my life? But it's never been something that has bothered me. It's always just been a time to reflect on how God made me into the person that I am today. And in those terms, I could not be more blessed or grateful for the path that He chose in my life by making me adopted. If I hadn't been adopted, I would not have had the family that I have. I probably would not have met my husband Brian, and therefore we would not have the two boys that we have today. I wouldn't have the friends that I have, the job that I have. I wouldn't have this church family that means so much to me. So that's why adoption has played a huge part in being how my life was formed. I'm gonna try not to cry through this. Growing up, you did have questions from people to say, well, why do you not look like your mom and dad? You know, you'd be a kid in school and your parents would come for an event and your friends in elementary school would pick up on the fact that you don't really look like your parents and your sister doesn't look like you. And so I would always have to respond with, well, that's because I'm adopted. And there were, most of the time, people just thought, oh, well, that's really cool or that's neat because I was the only person that they knew that was adopted. But there were some instances where you'd have a kid who would say, well, that means that your mom and dad didn't want you or they didn't love you. And that never, thankfully, took hold in my heart because my mom and dad always made sure that my sister and I both knew that we were loved and valued more than anything else in their life, regardless of the fact that we were adopted. And so even now, if somebody says to me, well, where's your real mom and dad? I always say my real mom and dad are the people who raised me. I can tell you exactly where they are. They're my family. So looking at family in that terms, real versus biological, your real family are the people that God put in your life to raise you, to give you your value system. My parents raised me in a Christian home, and I could not be more thankful for that because that value has now been able to be passed on to my kids. So that's who your real parents are when you're adopted. I have the utmost respect and thankfulness for my birth mother without knowing her entire story because of the choice that she made to place me for adoption. In the late 70s, it could have been a very easy decision for her to have an abortion instead, rather than carry me to term, give birth, and have to place me for adoption. When I was 24 years old, I found out some information from my adoption agency, just as far as non-identifying information that they're allowed to release in the state of Kentucky. And at that time, I found out that my birth mother had been 19 when she had me, but her own mother had died when she was 13, and she, by the age of 19, had been married and divorced and gotten pregnant with me. And at the time, my sister was 19 years old. So being able to look at her at that age and think that at 19 to have gone through the experience of losing your parent, getting married, getting divorced, having a baby, and placing that baby for adoption, it gave me a whole new level of gratitude for my birth mother. To think that at such a young age she had gone through so much trauma in her own life. So then again, when I had both of my boys, that gave me another level of thankfulness and gratitude for her, because I couldn't imagine having to be put in that position to make the decision to sacrificially allow an agency or an organization to find the right family for your child. And that must have been a huge step of faith for her to place me through a Christian agency, knowing that value system was going to be a priority. So I'm just grateful for the decision that she made, because at 39 years old, I have led a pretty charmed life. And it all started with, when I was born, God crafted my story to say, this child is going to be adopted by this family. She's going to grow up and go to college and get married to a wonderful guy and have 2 beautiful boys and have a wonderful job that she loves and a church that she loves just as much. So with every adoption story, just like all of our stories, God crafts every bit of it. He was in control from the very beginning. And I think about just what that means for each of us when we're adopted into God's family as Christians. And that's been the illustration that I've been able to use with our boys when explaining to them about what it means for me to be adopted, but also what that means for me to be adopted as a Christian into God's family, and that how hopefully one day we're praying that they'll make that same decision for themselves to be adopted into God's family. Brian and I had made the decision and felt God's leading to adopt a child, and had gone through a local agency here in town that had been recommended to us by Jeff and Amy True, and had gone through the process of getting confirmed with that agency and certified through the state. And when Hunter, our oldest, was 15 months old, we got a call from the agency saying that a birth mom had chosen us, and that her baby had just been born the previous day, and she wanted to meet us. And so this was called one of those last-minute placements, where we're scrambling around trying to get everything together. We had to drive to a hospital in another county here in Kentucky, where we met her that day, and she explained to us that she had read our profile and talked to the social worker from our agency and felt that we were the family that she wanted to raise her child. She liked the fact that we already had a child. She loved the fact that I was adopted. In fact, she and I were only a day apart in age. So she was 33 years old, just like me at the time. We brought Connor home from the hospital. We were the ones that named him. We had him in our home for 18 days. When he was 10 days old, our agency contacted us and said that a man had come forward claiming to be Connor's birth father and did not know that the birth mother had been pregnant, and he wanted a DNA test because he wanted custody of his child if Connor was in fact his. We had had Connor for 10 days, and at that point got the call about that a man had claimed to be his birth father and wanted to find out for sure. So we had to take him for DNA testing here in town and then spend the next 8 days waiting for those results. And Brian and I were on edge a lot of that time, praying and asking God to make sure that whatever happened in this situation, that we would have peace with it. Every time the phone rang, I would jump, wondering if this was going to be the call that was going to tell us one way or another whether we were going to be able to keep Connor as our son. And on day 18, I was home by myself. Brian had run a quick errand, and our social worker from the agency called us. And when I answered the phone and she told me who it was, I knew immediately what the answer was going to be. The DNA test results had shown that the man was in fact Connor's father, and he had gotten the results and was in the process of going to court to get an emergency custody agreement so that he could take custody of his son. We were going to have to report to the agency with Connor within 2 hours, and that was going to be the end of our relationship with him. Brian came in the door right after I got off the phone, and I immediately remember crying and saying, "We don't know who we're giving him to. What is this family like? Is this person on drugs? Are they an alcoholic? What kind of family situation is he going to be raised in? We have no control over this." And I wrote an email asking for prayer to our family, several of our friends here at church, and asking them to pray that Connor would be protected, and pray for us that we would be able to show God through this situation, because it was the hardest thing that either one of us was going to have to do. When we got to the agency, we sat with our social worker waiting for Connor's father to arrive. And we just sat and cried. And our social worker apologized over and over that this was happening, but it was at no fault of theirs. Connor's birth mother had not been truthful about the entire situation. His birth father had not known that she was pregnant. She had not disclosed that to the agency. She had given a completely different story. And at that point, she was not answering any phone calls from the agency social workers. So we were required to hand him over to his father. And I remember just sitting there and praying the entire time, asking God to make sure that this was going to be a good family for Connor, because at 18 days old, he had already been through so much. And when his birth father walked in, he had brought his sister with him, Connor's aunt, and we had the opportunity to sit and talk with them, get to know them a little bit. And the gratitude that they expressed to us for the way that we had taken care of Connor during that time put me so much at ease to know that God was using this situation just like he does every situation in our lives, but that he was going to use this for good. And as heartbroken as Brian and I were leaving that agency that day without Connor as our son, we looked back on that experience now, almost 6 years later, and say, God used that for good because he used us to get Connor to his dad. We look at it as, had we not been the family that God had given Connor to, we don't know what would have happened. And we look at it and think, thank God that his dad came forward in that time, because neither one of us would have been able to live with the fact of knowing years later that this man wanted to raise his son and had just not had the opportunity. Connor will be 6 this summer. He is a happy little boy. We have the blessing of still being in contact with his dad and his aunt. His aunt sends us pictures every year at Christmas. We're Facebook friends with them. And we can definitely look back on that time and say that this all worked out according to God's will and for his good. Had the situation with Connor been different, if we had been able to keep him and raise him as our son, there's a good chance that we would not have had any more children. And if any of you know my 4-year-old Drew, you know that the world is a much more fun place with him in it. So God blessed our family in ways that we could not even imagine, even though we went through a lot of turmoil and heartache through this adoption experience. If you feel like you're being called to grow your family through adoption, pray about it, talk to other families who have experienced it, find an agency that you trust, because that makes all the difference. And if God chooses to grow your family through adoption, He will work out all of the kinks and make sure that that happens.